Hi, friends. Welcome to the first episode number 1 of our special limited series on Christian Zionism. You might have heard this from me before, but this series is going to be 10 episodes long. It's going to be a deep dive into the history of Christian Zionism, into the theology or the theologies of Christian Zionism, and also, I think more crucially for us today, also the political activism of Christian Zionism, especially in the US. And I couldn't think of a better person to help us ground the conversation, to help us examine the roots of Christian Zionism than the person who actually literally wrote the book on the roots of Christian Zionism, Robert O. Smith. The name of the book that he authored is called More Desired Than Our Owne Salvation, The Roots of Christian Zionism. Briefly, Robert O. Smith is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. He lives in Texas. He is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Texas. I actually have known Robert for a while now. I met him in Palestine maybe 5-6 years ago, actually longer. He used to pastor the Lutheran Church in Jerusalem, and I have met him through different occasions since then as well. A brilliant, fascinating, insightful person and a scholar and a historian of Christian Zionism. I'm excited for you to begin this series with us through this conversation with Robert. And unlike common belief about the roots of Christian Zionism, you probably think that it started in the 19th century. Actually, Robert traces it all the way back to the 16th century, to the Reformation, analyzing how the Protestant movement has developed its own theology, but also its own anxiety and thoughts about the end times and how it perceived the other, whether it's the Catholic, whether it's the Muslim, the Turks, or whether it is the Jews. A very fascinating journey through the history from the 16th century until today. And Robert takes us on that journey, starting from the Reformation, the 16th century in continental Europe, all the way to Britain, and then across the Atlantic to the US. A really fascinating and I think an important conversation to help us make sense of Christian Zionism, of how essential it is to the imagination and the theology and the thinking of so many Christians back in the day and also today. And also, crucially for us, of how to think about its impact and its connection to the culture where we live. And if you're a Patreon supporter, I'm going to continue the conversation with Robert, where we're going to have this, I'm going to ask him this question. Well, so what if we know this history? What does this history mean to us today? And how do we think about the history and apply it to our lived reality today? A really fascinating conversation with Robert O. Smith. If you want to check out that extended conversation, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Just go to patreon.com/across the divide. So without further ado, here's the first episode of our series, my conversation with Robert O. Smith. Robert Smith, thank you for joining us on the podcast. This is the first episode of our series on Christian Zionism, and I'm very grateful for you to be here with us and kind of lead us in this conversation on the history of Christian Zionism. So thank you for being here with me.
Oh, Daniel, I'm so happy to be here. This is a topic that I've sat with for a very long time, and I'm seeing this resurgence of interest in the topic in the midst of the current fighting in Gaza, and I'm so happy to be contributing through this medium.
Oh, that's fantastic. So just for the audience's sake, can you tell us a bit about your background and especially why you got interested in examining the history of Christian Zionism?
Sure. Well, let's start with the story.
Right.
I grew up in Oklahoma City, and my parents are from Baptist and kind of frontier evangelical backgrounds. And so that led us into being regular attendees at an Assemblies of God church in Oklahoma City. So Assemblies of God is kind of this white mainstream Pentecostal tradition, and that includes speaking in tongues and all sorts of Armageddon theology as part of the tradition that I was raised in. And it was also one of Oklahoma City's first mega churches. So Trinity Broadcasting Network, the big Christian TV network, would broadcast from our church on Sunday evenings. So Paul and Jan Crouch were part of my upbringing. And so that's what I come from. There's a lot of talk about Israel, a lot of talk about missions in Africa. I remember those two main themes. And then the in the 80s, that's when I was being raised there, all sorts of talk about the possibility of nuclear annihilation. So all those things came together in the popular Christianity of my youth. So you can get a sense of where I come from. I'm not there now, but that's where I'm from.
Okay.
And when I got to so I went to seminary, became a Lutheran minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So that's going to a mainline denomination after being raised evangelical Pentecostal fundamentalist. Is not usually how that goes, but that's what I did. And, was it at war with the church of my childhood, that theology of my childhood? Well, eventually I wound up getting an MA in Islamic Studies at Luther Seminary. And then I went on to PhD study, kind of this meandering path through grad school. A PhD study at Baylor University, Texas Baptist Institution in Texas, where I studied with a Jewish liberation theologian named Mark Ellis.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was the, this path, right? So studying Jewish Christian-Muslim relations, especially then at Baylor in the post-Holocaust era, looking at ethics and history, those sorts of questions. And in that time, I began reinterrogating the church of my childhood. And when it came time to propose my dissertation topic at Baylor, it was 2005, and my awareness of Christian Zionism was developing. So here's where the story really begins. I presented my proposal to my advisor, who was a Baptist historian. So by that time, I'd switched advisors. And his immediate question was, well, where are your primary sources? He was an historian, and that's what a historian asks. Well, I was convinced that I had all the primary sources. They were newspaper articles from the contemporary era because I was convinced that Christian Zionism was a recent problem. Mm-hmm. And so I was stuck in the present, presuming that Christian Zionism was a new thing that arose in the 1900s as a result of bad theology developed toward the end of the 1800s. And now, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, since the topic was relatively new to me, it was new to all of academia at the time. But people were trying to talk about this, but didn't really have the tools to do that. And so when I first started talking about Christian Zionism, I made all sorts of mistakes because I was repeating the mistakes of other people who were talking about the topic. And that's what led me on my research journey to come up with a different understanding of what this problem is.
That's so fascinating. Can you just, before we kind of dig deep with these kind of primary sources, because you take us all the way back to the 16th century, but I'm out of curiosity and kind of feel free to share as much as you want, but what led you to leave that Assemblies of God environment and go to a mainstream Lutheran space? That seems to be a big jump. And I think there would be a bit of shame and guilt for kind of leaving a very conservative space into a more progressive kind of liberal space theologically, kind of your faith community and so on. So I think people would be interested in this because I know that a number of our audience and followers who came out grew up in these conservative spaces, evangelical and otherwise, and now are wrestling with faith. What does faith look like now that they have discovered that there's a pernicious, really awful kind of underbelly of kind of their church community? So yeah, what happened to you? What snapped, and how did you move away from it?
Well, that's a whole other episode, Daniel. And because it's very, like with everybody, it's a very personal story, right? It is about my family, about my own experiences. And so I think, to boil it all down, the big question at the center of everything for me is that I had a brother who died when I was 2.5 years old. He was 5. He died of leukemia, and his name is Matthew. And my parents suffered in evangelical environments for that. And so I, of course, as a young person, I wasn't completely aware of all those dynamics. But when I became a middle schooler in Oklahoma City, um, the prosperity gospel never made sense to me. That if you were praying the right way and acting the right way, believing the right way, that God would bless you, and that things would turn out well for you. That was the theology of the church I was raised in, and frankly, that's the kernel of contemporary Christian Zionism. That's so important. This idea that if you support Israel, God will bless you and bless your nation. Right? That Genesis 12:3 misreading, and so that prosperity gospel never sat right with me. When I was 16, as an only child, my parents and I moved to Germany. From my dad had a position with the U.S. government there, and we went to church once on the military base, and it was boring because we'd been in this mega church with all the show and glitz and glamour, and we went to church at a boring chaplaincy on the base, and I realized then this was all cultural. We were going to church as a cultural reality, not because we were deeply committed. And so we just never went back. And it was after this period of kind of wandering and wondering and trying to reconnect with a church that I could not reconnect with because of its fundamental theology. I finally got reintroduced to Christianity, but it happened to be Lutherans who did it for me. It could have been lots of other traditions, right? But it happened to be Lutherans. And that's how I wound up in that tradition. And it was a tradition that invited intellectual inquiry, that invited difficult questions. And I would never say that Lutherans are the only ones who do that. But for me, that's the community I found, and that's the space that I connected to.
And even though you, in a way, still remained in that environment, because, well, not in that same environment, but for example, you went to Baylor, so a Baptist university, so you still had some kind of affinity or some kind of connection to those spaces, at least.
Well, I didn't go to Baylor to be around evangelicals. I went to Baylor to be around this one Jewish liberation theologian, right? Mark Ellis, yeah. And then all the other stuff happened. But what was fascinating at Baylor, I was in constant conflict with evangelical classmates in my doctoral program. And they can confirm that. But part of that, the dynamic I saw there was Baptist young men converting to Catholicism, attempting to find power in the magisterium to enforce their anti-abortion beliefs. So I saw evangelicals, just this will to power happening, connecting with Christians and other traditions that also have this Christian nationalist will to power, and I was battling against that the entire time. So it's
interesting.
It's an amazing thing. Evangelicals are a complicated bunch, and I've had a lot of experiences.
Yeah, putting it lightly, complicated. By the way, for the audience, Mark Ellis was a wonderful Jewish theologian, liberation theologian. He wrote a seminal work on Jewish liberation theology. And it was, I think for me at least, it was this powerful moment where Jewish thinking was infused with Palestinian liberation. And he wrote phenomenal works since then as well. And he just passed away, I think, a month or so ago, which was very sad as well.
August of 2024 now. He died in June. And next week we have his memorial service coming up. And so it's very important.
Yeah, very wonderful, fantastic thinker and reflective person, and just beautiful author as well. So, yeah, Mark Ellis, just make sure to look him up and maybe read some of his works. Okay, so there's an irony of you joining the Lutheran Church, because in your work on the roots of Christian Zionism, just reading through your works, you begin with Luther and the Reformation and you see in that 16th century, the beginning of the 15th century, as the kind of the beginnings of these anxieties about different people groups, especially Muslims and Jews and so on. And then that, for you, as from your analysis, is kind of these were the beginnings or the roots of Christian Zionism. So can you take us there to the 16th century and kind of show us, explain to us, how do you see the beginnings of Christian Zionism in that era, in that time?
Well, I think any of us who are honest in 2024 don't actually want to go back to the 16th century. But um, yeah, the Reformation context is so important to understanding Christian Zionism today. And that's, I'm kind of an accidental historian. I never wanted to read much history when I was young. It's too much reading, too many dates and facts and figures. But it was the study of Christian Zionism that got me into historiographic methods and primary source research in this way. And what happened is that in that challenge from Barry Hankins, the professor, the challenge to get me to look at primary sources, I started just searching the origins of premillennial. What does that mean? What is dispensation? What is dispensationalism? All those concepts go back to the beginning of the Reformation era in the early 1500s. Well, in the context of the Reformation, in that period, you have a dual threat to this budding evangelical movement that didn't call themselves Lutherans or anything like that. They were evangelicals, the people of the gospel. So the threat to that budding movement, on one hand, was Roman Catholicism, and on the other hand was the Turk. So the Islamic armies at the gates of Vienna during Luther's lifetime. And so the Reformation can't really be understood. We usually, I think, in Protestant circles talk about the battle with the Catholic Church. We rarely discuss that external threat from the Islamic Empire or the Ottoman Empire. But of course, the Christian leaders and people at that time were very conscious of the possibility of being invaded by, overrun by the Ottomans. And that's a key awareness. So in that context of dual threat, you have this quest for hope. From where will my hope come? Mm. And the hope then is generated, especially in English Protestant biblical interpretation. The hope is generated in this people of the Bible known as Jews. Now, in Germany, Luther had direct contact with Jews. He learned Hebrew from Jews. We all are very aware of Luther's complicated and abhorrent speech about Jews, especially later in his life, that has been roundly condemned and repudiated by our Lutheran leaders and the ELCA, the Lutheran World Federation. In England, Jews had been banished by Richard II. And so in that context, when theology in the late 1500s is being written by John Bale, his commentary in the book of Revelation, when he's talking about Jews as this chosen people of God and Jews who will be allies to Christians in this final apocalyptic battle against Roman Catholicism and Islam, by 1545, he's writing this sort of thing. He's talking about Jews as mythological beings because they're not present in his life. They're only people imagined through the text, imagined through the Bible. And that's what's distinctive about this English Protestant Judeo-centric biblical interpretation. So I think that's the context.
Just going back before we continue in that kind of the Anglo, the British space there, I think I'm curious to know, and I think people would be curious to know, if Luther was in touch with Jewish folks, why would he develop, or at least in his writings, why would he develop such a very negative attitude towards them, accusing them of deceit and lying, and also all kind of accusations? Like, what's happening in his environment to make him make those accusations against them?
There are two general ways to talk about that, and I don't want to engage in any apologetics that would justify Luther's speech. So, we're seeking to avoid that. One way to understand that in its historical context is to say that Luther had a deep hope that everyone would be desirous of conversion to this new vision, right? This new evangelical vision of Christian hope. And then you see in that, so of course he would want to convince fellow Roman Catholics. He was an Augustinian monk, and if it was good enough for him, it should be good enough for my fellow Catholics. But then by that point, the 15th, 16th century long Christian desire to convert Jews, which is baked into Christianity. That's this desire to convince and convert Jews to Christian faith, that finally now is the time. And then by the end of his life, he was frustrated that wasn't happening. So that's one of the explanations. Another explanation is based on economic competitions between German evangelicals and Jewish merchants, traders in the area. And so there was clear economic conflict that also fed into this vitriol. Again, that we can go through those historical records and explain without justifying.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And also because I think Luther had to say a lot of also awful things about Catholics and about the Pope. And so, I mean, it seems that those are going hand in hand here, maybe because of his own frustration that they're not listening to him, and so he would accuse them of all sorts of horrible things.
And just more detail on that. Curiously, Luther and Melanchthon advocated for the publication of a Latin translation or interpretation of the Quran, so that Christians could better understand their enemies. And the preface, they wrote prefaces to the translation of the Quran into Latin.
Interesting.
That is so the understanding of Luther's understanding of Islam is very different than what's happening in the English Protestant context at that time.
Okay, but Latin, not German, because he translated the Bible into German, but he wants to give the Bible back to the Quran to the Catholic Church in a sense, right?
In a way, yeah. Well, it was the reserving of the Quran to the learned classes as opposed to the
right to the the people, right? The masses. Yeah. Okay. So you moved us moving away from Luther and Calvinism. You didn't mention Calvin, but I think he was part of the same kind of feel or attitudes. But then you moved us towards John Bale and the English environment and just kind of Jewish hope, I think you called it. And there's this, Judeo-Christian, Judeo-centrism and apocalyptic hope, you call it in your book. So what is this kind of, how is that forming there and kind of in John Bale's thought and also in England as well?
Yeah. So as things develop, as they do, let's see, I'm trying to get to some quotes in my own writing about this, but as those ideas develop, when John Bale writes his book, The Image of Both Churches in 1545, it's in the Elizabethan era, and he places hope in this idea of the national conversion of Jews to Protestant faith. So again, you see that conversionary focus. And so Bale is kind of kicking off that tradition. But in other later English interpretations, there's this idea that somehow in the apocalyptic battle, there's a 4-part structure where you've got the common enemy of Protestants as Catholics, then this idea that the natural enemy of Jews is the Muslim or the Turk. And that, again, that naturalization of that Christian imagination about Jewish-Muslim conflict, which of course doesn't bear, when you look at the history of Christian-Muslim or Jewish-Muslim relations, there isn't as much conflict as there is with Christians. And so but the Protestant English imagination about what that natural relationship is, they are our natural allies, these Jews, and their natural enemy is the Turk, who's also our enemy. And so in the end, the army that will march as part of the final apocalyptic battle will be made up of Jews converted to Christianity as a nation and Christians. And we're going to fight these two apocalyptic enemies, and we will win to usher in the millennium. So by the middle of the 1600s, that's the vision that's being cast.
How does anti-Semitism play a role here then in that? Because there's a sort of an affinity towards the Jew versus the Muslim, but I'm told that anti-Semitism was rife and normalized in that environment. So it seems to be this anti-Semitism would be a very complicated phenomenon. Then there's hostility, but there's also desire and hope happening at the same time.
Well, I think, anti-Semitism is, of course, a concept that gets coined a little bit later. But
Hmm.
I think what's really important to note here is that we're talking again about a Christian imagination about Jews, and
Hmm.
it's an essentializing of
Right.
Jewish
Right.
identity, but even more than that, an essentializing of Jewish existence. So if you think about this in the broad sweep of Christian Jewish relations throughout history up to the mid 1600s, say, you have this deeply anti-Jewish teaching within Christianity. It's absolutely normalized now. Again, in 2024, we're post Vatican II, post Nostra Aetate, and so we don't speak openly. We don't accept anti-Jewish categories and terms in the way we speak in Christianity. Up until 1965, that was completely fine, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
we have shifted dramatically in how the church speaks about Jews and Judaism. So that in the 1600s, essentializing Jewish existence for the purpose of Christian apocalyptic hope was not a big deal at all, right? That was not considered unethical. But that's the I would say this: if anti-Jewish teaching, anti-Judaism is the basis of anti-Semitism as a modern racial category,
Right.
as that develops later on, then you're seeing, if you're essentializing and saying that another group's existence is tied to your own purposes and that your existence only serves my interest, then I think we have a strong basis for anti-Semitism. Um, I and still today, I'm very wary of philo-Semitic Christianities, including many forms of contemporary Christian Zionism, not all, that essentialize Jewish existence in ways that are extremely problematic. So, studying with Mark Ellis in my PhD, but living in Jerusalem for 4 years, making many Israeli friends in that time, living next to many different types of Jewish communities along with Palestinian communities. The amazing diversities of Judaism and Jewish life and the debates within Jewish communities, none of that is recognized if I'm essentializing your community's existence for my purposes, right? That it's just, we're not treating them as human at that point, just as mythological figures in a book.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and so this is kind of where, like, well, why you're telling us about history? Who cares about the 16th century? It's like, well, actually, what is happening then is happening now, and the essentialization and honestly, like using Jews in the Christian Zionist imagination is so powerful and so prevalent today, and like a common critique of Christian Zionism, at least some of its dispensational forms, is you want to bring Jews to Palestine so that eventually you would kill them off when Christ would come back. So at least this is a crude way of putting it, but yeah, there's this kind of, you're using them because of your own hope, because of your own desire, apocalyptic desire, and you're essentializing them. You're putting them all in a group. There's no diversity among Jews, right? All of them are just going to be one people group that is going to be plopped over there. And then eventually, some of them would convert, but you're using them, right? You want to use them, and then eventually you don't care if they're gonna die. So I mean, I think that it seems to me, and I'm reading this from what you're saying, that I can see how this kind of synthesis that is happening in the 16th and 17th century about Jews and hope is actually playing itself out in a very concrete way right now in very powerful Christian Zionist organizations, especially Kufi, Christian United for Israel, and others like it who are doing this work today.
That's exactly right. And I think to talk again, kind of the Western civilization question that's here, recall that this is happening in the context of modernity itself. The idea of modernity is being formed at the same time these ideas of early forms of Christian Zionism, and that colonization, this practice of European colonization of the rest of the planet, uh, which is the hallmark of modernity, is being practiced, and that Christian Zionism, from its very first expression, is a colonizing vision, an imperial colonizing vision. And so that for that, you have to go back to 1649 for the very first example of Christian Zionism, according to my definition of Christian Zionism, which says that it's political action informed by Christian commitments to promote or preserve Jewish control over the geographic area of Israel and Palestine. And that political action question is really important in my definition, because I want to distinguish that from theology and ideas alone, ideologies. It's when you decide you're going to take action on that, you're going to organize political forces and military power behind that. That becomes Christian Zionism at that point. Some people have disagreed with that definition. Totally fine. We're kind of trying to figure out this phenomenon that is dangerous in the world, and other definitions are just fine. But
I would love to unpack that with you in a bit. But yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. But so in 1649, Joanna and Ebenezer Cartwright, who are a mother and son team of English citizens living in Amsterdam, they put a petition to the War Council, because this is in the middle of the English Civil Wars. Lord Thomas Fairfax is the chair of the War Council. His deputy is Oliver Cromwell. And so a lot of people know Cromwell's name. And they, this petition, since they're living in Amsterdam among Jewish communities, allowed to live there openly, unlike in England, they argue that the nation of England, with the inhabitants of the Netherlands, shall be the first and readiest to transport Israel's sons and daughters in their ships to the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for an everlasting inheritance. It's a lot to unpack in that, because first of all, they're saying that by doing this, if we take this action, by which mercy your petitioners are assured that the wrath of God will be much appeased towards you. So the war will end if we take this action. And I think that's a key. And that's the political, that's the prosperity gospel component of this, the quid pro quo. Now, they're urging England to collaborate with the Netherlands. This is before England and the Netherlands went to war over shipping lanes in their colonizing practice and their transatlantic trade. But also the ships that they're talking about are merchant ships, but they're also ships of war. And so in this very first expression of Christian Zionism, the tools of empire are the tools that are being envisioned for fulfilling God's purposes. And I think that we see absolutely that same dynamic today, where Christian Zionism relies on power, state power, and state domination to fulfill God's purposes.
Okay. So this is how you're defining Christian Zionism. Also because you mentioned us, I think in your work, also Francis Kett, also that discusses also Jewish restoration to Palestine. So you're saying that Christian Zionism comes out of Christian anxieties and hopes and frustrations about the Jewish people, and that eventually leads to the formulation of a theopolitical movement, perhaps, that is employing the power of the time, which is colonization, and the power of the empire to move Jews to Palestine.
Right.
And
at least a vision. That's
at least there's a vision for that. Why do they want Jews to be in Palestine at that time?
Well, because it's the promise that's been given to them biblically. So fulfilling land promises in the Bible. And part of it, the Jewish community at the time, knowing in this early modern period, already feeling the threat of expulsions, feeling the threat. The Jewish community at the time was interested also in colonization, in migration to Palestine. They weren't yet imagining colonization and imperial moves, That comes later. But there was an interest in seeing what Jewish existence might be in the Ottoman lands of Palestine. But the Christian interest was, as the Cartwrights lay out in 1649, the Christian interest is so we'll stop fighting each other. So it's all about us in the end. And I think, when your Christianity is all about you in the end, you got problems.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
All right, so there's this kind of desire to expel the Jews out of Europe, which is, to me, such an odd thing. But I guess they could do it, right? Because they have the power to do it, perhaps. Yeah. And maybe there was a common phenomenon that you can expel and ethnically cleanse people. Maybe that was common at the time.
So in 1492. Most Americans would understand that that's when Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Right. Okay. Right.
But in 1490, the other thing that marked 1492, beyond European encounter with the Western Hemisphere and the beginnings of the colonization of the indigenous peoples of this hemisphere, was the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal. And so this ideal of expulsion of foreign ethnic groups becomes emblematic for how we assert a homogeneous identity, a national identity. I see, again, this theme of modernity, right? And so the expulsion of that group means that we are more purely us at this point. We are Christian, we are English. We are
more powerful, right?
More powerful.
So if you can regain the reconquest of Spain, of Andalus, right? If you push them all out, the Jews and the Muslims, okay, well, look, we have our dignity back, we have our power back, we have our control of Europe. And these minorities are the reason for our weakness or disempowerment or what have you.
It's like you're listening to a campaign rally today.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof. Okay, I didn't expect that connection, but oh my goodness, yes, yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun, right?
This is like, folks, this is why history matters. This is why you need to know history. Oh my goodness, yes, okay. I want to deal with, at the end, for our Patreon supporters, I want to talk with you about why this should matter today and how we can see this displaying itself out in a concrete way. Yeah, Christian power and hopes and anxieties, I think, are kind of leading to this idea of Jews are disappointing us, and they're, and there's anti-Jewish sentiment is there in the air as well. So there's a beginning of, well, you know what, maybe we should move them out and maybe we should take them to Palestine, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's this idea of, and of course the Zionist project from the European Christian perspective was a project of expulsion, right? It was a way, the Jewish problem, again, this emblematic problem of modernity itself, Foucault identifies that as the case. Right. Yeah. This is one way to solve the Jewish problem, is to export them to another part of the planet, and so this impulse on the part of Europe is this ongoing impulse, and I think things are different in the United States when the idea of America starts to form, and we can cross the Atlantic to get to that conversation. But this idea that Jews should be expelled and that we're going to offload them to this other part of the world where they can still serve our interest in lots of different ways.
Okay. Now, we want to talk about the kind of across the Atlantic and go to that, how these ideas also make themselves into the American experience, or the North American experience. But now, where do you see how that transition happening between England and what's happening in England then, and then the migration out of England of religious minorities and persecuted minorities, who then maybe carried a lot of that sentiment with them, as well as the pilgrims kind of moved to North America to Turtle Island? What's happening there? Yeah.
Yeah. So these Puritans who are ridiculed by the establishment in England then make their way to North America and the colonies, colonizing this land. And there's a lot of all the discourse is theological discourse as much as it's political and economic discourse. And I think we make a mistake, though, if we say that the theology doesn't stand on its own as a driving factor. And so when these communities get to North America and they have their various experiences, their struggles, part of what begins to form in New England, especially, is this idea of America as a land with a separate mission and purpose apart from the motherland, apart from the colonial or the imperial center. And the people who are forming this idea primarily in New England, in what is now Massachusetts, Boston, are the Mathers. So Increased Mather and Cotton Mather. These folks who are very connected to Harvard University. This idea of America itself is forming in New England. It eventually becomes what's called the New England Consensus as the foundation of American identity. And Christian Zionism is absolutely woven through every fiber of this concept of America. And it is very much about the shining, as John Winthrop says, first governor of Massachusetts, to be the shining city on the hill. And so this Deuteronomistic understanding of proper society, living according to God's law, again, to receive God's blessing, this prosperity gospel baked in to the foundation. This is a Christian Zionist vision. One of the questions that was asked is, well, who are these other humans, human-like creatures who are living in this space? So I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. When they're encountering tribes in the Northeast, they seem to be human, but they're clearly not quite human. They're not civilized like us. And so they start theorizing, who are these people? And this idea of the lost tribes of Israel, maybe these are the lost tribes, comes up. A theologian writes from England with disdain toward these Puritans in the New World and says, no, in fact, all that you're encountering there are the holding pen of demons waiting for the final battle of Armageddon. And in that, when the response comes from Judge Samuel Sewall to that accusation from Joseph Meade, he says, this is an antique fancy of America's being hell. In fact, this is the location of the New Jerusalem. Then you've got the apocalyptic vision shaping up for what America is going to be. And so this grandiose, exceptionalist vision of America starts to form in this period, of course, prior to the founding of the United States, and is in direct relation to Christian Zionist ideas.
And even before then, you said 1492. Because I read some of the writings of Christopher Columbus himself, and maybe I'm wrong here, this is inaccurate, but he was super religious, and he had a lot of anxieties about also Muslims, and he considered that the gold that he would be getting from India, I think, or from, I guess by the time he knew that he was somewhere else, would help fund the campaigns to retake the Holy Land. And there's a lot of a kind of apocalyptic sentiment in his writings and his journals on those ships as he was crossing over. So there's that apocalyptic desire for the Holy Land and for the New Jerusalem, I think, was there even in the 15th century for him.
Indeed, there is. And so he's extremely focused on that struggle. He was indeed hoping to fund a new crusade. Some people do want to describe him as a Christian Zionist in that way. My sense is that in what I've read so far, I'm considering these ideas, I don't think he was a Christian Zionist in the same way because he didn't instrumentalize Jews for his purposes. It was a Christian fight centering Christians for this struggle against Islam. Jews were an additional enemy, not something. But I could be very wrong about that. You've likely read more than I have. But it's what's also distinct too when you think about this New England vision. All of a sudden, the New Jerusalem is located on a different continent altogether.
Right, yeah.
That's a displacement. That's, talk about a break of consciousness, right? And I think that then helps explain the dissonance of later forms of Christian Zionism that say that even when you think about Christian Zionist nationalisms, where the modern nation state of Israel is frankly more primary to God's purposes than the United States, in the sense the United States will fall away in the Christian Zion, in John Hagee's Christian Zionist vision, for instance. And what a break of a traditional American nationalist idea. And I think you see the beginnings of that in this New England transference of the New Jerusalem to this new hemisphere.
So how does that develop from this kind of, we're reaching the promised land, the New Jerusalem,
right,
escaping persecution, the Puritans, Anabaptists, what have you.
Right.
And how does that just in a concrete way, like what's the sentiment there towards Jewish people? And then how does Christian Zionism kind of find its kind of concrete way or kind of formation?
Yeah, so there are two different ways. One way is to talk about a couple centuries later with the formation of the Church of Jesus Christ in Latter-day Saints, where this idea of Zion, right, in North America is migrating as well through what is North America. So Mormon apocalypticism is directly informed by these ideas, again, of the lost tribes of Israel. But then in early specifically United States thought, you have these explicit communications of the inclusion of Jews in the American project. And you see these letters from George Washington and James Madison to Jewish communities. And so there's a broad consensus that Jews are present in this space and are welcome in this space. There's an economic interest in that as well. But the religious logic is pretty clear that the Jews are very much part of the American consensus. There's less talk of Muslims at the time, but Muslims are also present. So that broad inclusion of diversity in the American experiment is part of the outgrowth of this. But specifically, this idea that the United States is going to take the place of England in God's plan for the nations, that form of, we call it manifest destiny. We usually associate that with the 19th century, of course. But this idea of American exceptionalism, that America is God's chosen nation, supplanting England that was before. And that is a very real part of American consciousness. So all of those ideas that the singular nation that's going to achieve God's purposes of global salvation, that those are ideas that form out of this Puritan Christian Zionist foundation.
Okay, but we're not finding there any kind of political maneuvering towards advocating for the Jewish people, to moving them to Palestine yet, right?
Not yet. That doesn't really come about in the United States until the late 1800s. And so you've got, the Christian Zionism becomes more of a Christian nationalism. Again, another current theme that needs to be discussed. All this informs Christian nationalism. Christian Zionism in the United States comes about especially in the life of William Blackstone. And so we're jumping ahead in the historical timeline. A lot of people want to associate Christian Zionism with rapture theology, with John Nelson Darby's premillennial dispensationalism, and those sorts of things. I argue in my book that Darby cannot be the foundation of Christian Zionism because he was anti-political. He refused, the brethren that he was leading refused political participation as part of their Christian responsibility. But he had no control over what Americans did with his ideas. And so he himself wasn't the progenitor of Christian Zionism, but William Blackstone took those ideas. He was a Chicago-based businessman. I would say the first quintessential American Christian Zionist. My friend Yaakov Ariel has done the foundational work on Blackstone. So Blackstone took these dispensationalist rapture theology sorts of ideas, the same ideas I grew up with in Oklahoma City, but blended them with an American political vision to give Palestine to the Jews. And he was writing those. He published his book, Jesus is Coming, in 1878. And then he issued his Blackstone Memorial in 1891. That was a petition signed by justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, by major newspaper editors, it was this who's who of American society at the time. And he presented it to President Harrison and said, we should give Palestine to the Jews. What an interesting concept, because it was part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. It wasn't yours to give. But of course, the Ottoman Empire was the, quote, sick man of Europe by that time. It could be dismantled. And so you have this imperial design on Palestine at the time. And he, by putting together this memorial, again, demonstrates that step into political action. So he has a second memorial that he developed after that, that got direct support from the budding Zionist movement. But I think what's fascinating about Blackstone is that he was doing this work prior to the rise of Jewish political Zionism, because Herzl's pamphlet Der Judenstaat was not published until 1897. And so Christian Zionism in this way predates, from 1649 to 1891, all forms of crystallized Christian Zionism predate any form of Jewish political Zionism. And I think that's something that Christians need to grapple with. Now, this is not something we point the finger at other people about. This is what Christians have given to the world.
Among other things.
Among other things, yeah.
What's Blackstone's, what's his motivation for thinking that the U.S. government can move the Jews to Palestine in the 19th century? What's his motivation there?
He was a successful businessman in Chicago. I think his motivation was pure religious faith. It was basically prosperity gospel at the time. He was, this is the time of the, the business magnates. He was trying to make his mark in a way among the Rockefellers and the Morgans and others. And so he was in Chicago, in the second city. So that was his motivation at the time, to be this major organizer of a religious, theopolitical, truly theological and political effort. I'm pretty sure that was his motivation. It's difficult to say. Okay. But he was extremely successful in organizing the societal push. And so this was at the time when Jews were suffering pogroms in Ukraine, in what is now Ukraine and Russia. Mm-hmm. And, he was sensitive to those needs. And then when he went on to the second memorial, he received direct support from the Zionist movement that had formed by that time. So he was welcomed in as a Christian Zionist among the earliest Jewish political Zionist movement.
Okay, so maybe this is how I would like to wrap this conversation, to talk about your definition of Christian Zionism. And I think there's a thread there that you're kind of alluding to, which is kind of the tension between the theological, biblical understanding of Christian Zionism, that definition that grounds it in the Bible and so on, and between the political activism that you're saying that this is actually the true not true, but a more proper, specific maybe definition. Because from my background, I've always said, well, when I talk about Christian Zionism, I would say, well, yeah, it began with the Christians, but then I would take it back to England, but I would take it to Darby and the Scofield Bible and so on.
Yeah.
But you're kind of I think it's obvious in your analysis that there's something political there before Darby and after Darby,
Mhm.
and there's attitudes towards Jews and even the Catholics and the Muslims and Jews, and also, like, I think something I noticed here is also this idea of expulsion and moving people as an essential political move for power for the empire. But anyway, so like when the Christian Zionists would be, when are we saying that Darby is the kind of a pivotal person here for us? You're saying no, he's not, right? When it comes to Christian Zionism, so what's happening? Can you unpack that from, like, why do you reject a reliance on saying the Bible is a reason for Christians, or misreading the Bible is a way for that? Because also, like, Blackstone and others that you were referencing here, I'm guessing they're also relying on the Bible so that the Bible is not. It is part of the question, the picture here, but there's something else that is happening, right?
Yeah, there is, and so you have about 16 questions packed into that question, and
sorry,
that's fine.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to students, I usually when I'm talking about this overall topic, I usually will say, when I first started out in this, I offered a bad definition of Christian Zionism, and that was that Christian Zionism builds on a system of futurist prophecy interpretation known as premillennial dispensationalism, and it places the state of Israel at the center of God's purposes for the end of the age. I mean, I think a lot of people would say that, well, that's Christian Zionism. My preferred definition now, what I through research I think is a better definition, is that Christian Zionism is political action informed by specifically Christian commitments to promote or preserve Jewish control over the geographic area now comprising Israel and Palestine. The benefit of that definition is that it moves backwards and forwards in history, that it accounts for 1649 and 1891 as well as 2024. That's just most basically the utility of that definition. Because if you say it's focused on the state of Israel, well, then you only start the clock of Christian Zionism in 1948.
Right.
And that's a problem, because then you're not explaining the Balfour Declaration and its Christian Zionist foundations in 1917. So we need a definition that is historically flexible. We also need a definition that's not tied to any particular theological system, because Christian Zionism takes on liberal as well as fundamentalist biblical interpretive forms and ethical interpretive forms. So you can be a post-Holocaust Christian theologian very concerned about Jewish safety, and have that system result in a Christian Zionist theological framework. And that happened in the 80s and 90s. We saw Catholics and mainline Protestants be explicit Christian Zionists based on that foundation. So we need a definition that accounts for them as well. It's not just about fundamentalists, even though that's our primary concern in many ways.
Usually fundamentalists, because they believe in the fundamentals, right? They think it's all about, what they believe. So, like, we want to give them a lot of power because, they think they have it all figured out. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, that this is not just a conservative Republican fundamentalist thing. It's pervasive. And I think your analysis is allowing us to see that this is pervasive. This is in the culture, in the soil, in the air of a lot of Christian anxieties and thinking and imaginations about the other, the Jew, the Muslim, the other, and so on. And also still plays itself out. Now, just a quick question then here. So the statement that we keep saying that this was invented by Christians, which is a land without a people for a people without a land.
Right.
For me, that seems to be a Christian Zionist one that came out in the 19th century. Yeah. But how would you define that? Like, how do you understand that phrase?
Well, I understand that phrase as it's the colonial imaginary. This idea of the emptiness of the land. And my And again, that it's the same in the United States and the expansionist realities of the United States across this continent and into the Pacific. The disregard of the present population is simply of no account, and that's so this anti-indigenous imaginary, so this land without a people. And certainly what's implied there is certainly no people who deserve it. Certainly no people who have a right to it. It is ours by right. Right. And then the colonizing power will come up with whatever self-justification, whatever salve to the conscience needs to be come up with to allow it to be okay. And so that's a self-reflexive process. That's a conversation with the colonizing self rather than any concern for the other. And of course, the discourses of savagery, which applied directly to both American Indian communities and to Palestinian communities. Even we see this now since October 7th of last year. In heightened form, that the savage simply is there to die, not to possess, not to cultivate, not to flourish, not to grow. And so I think land without people for a people without a land it's simply a colonial imaginary that we've seen in too many places.
Right. And it goes hand in hand with Christian attitudes and readings of the scriptures and how that has been weaponized, I think, through Christian Zionism and otherwise.
It certainly does, but that's Christian the Christian projection of these horrible dynamics onto other communities. This designation of the non-Christian as the infidel, right? If we are the people of God and you're not the people of God, then your job is to fade away in face of our advance. And that's that is not something that is limited to Zionism. We need to learn in the Christian community is that whatever we see happening in Zionism or in the policies of the state of Israel, in the brutal forms that we currently have, we did it first. And there's a lot of modeling that we've provided that many other countries have taken up for their benefit.
Oof, yeah, there's that's really good. That's and gosh, man, this has nothing to do, at least in my reading as a Palestinian Christian, this has nothing to do with the faith or Christianity. This is obviously motivated by power and domination and colonization and dehumanization. But this kind of weaponization of the text, well, this is what I want. I want power and domination. I want to dehumanize others. And I might as well use the Bible. Might as well justify it using my faith. And this was in the 16th century. This was, throughout Christian history and continues today unabated. Robert Smith, this has been fantastic. Stick around. I want to talk with you more about the implication of these things for us today. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us. This has been really fascinating and interesting. Appreciate the thorough detail and analysis you put into this. It's been really helpful to me, and I'm sure for the audience as well.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.